I am going to have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this conference, Judge Britt Grant. Judge Grant is a proud graduate of the Westminster Schools here in Atlanta, of Wake Forest University, and of Stanford Law School. Even before she attended law school, Judge Grant has committed her career to upholding the rule of law, serving our nation, and defending the Constitution. Immediately after graduating college, she served in the office of then U.S. Representative Nathan Deal. She then served in several policy roles in the White House, and she was actually serving in the White House the morning that our nation was attacked on September 11th, an experience that deepened her resolve to protect our constitutional order and the security it preserves. She then went on to law school, where she served as president of the Stanford Law School chapter of the Federalist Society, and she co-founded the Stanford National Security and the Law Society. After the law school, she clerked for then Judge Brett Kavanaugh on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She then practiced law at the law firm of Kirkland Ellis before answering the call to return home to Georgia to continue her public service as the second Solicitor General of the state of Georgia. As Solicitor General, she displayed extraordinary courage in advancing the rule of law and advocating for adherence to our state and federal constitutions. Under her leadership, Georgia confronted some of its most significant litigation on novel and complex constitutional questions. She was also the mastermind behind Georgia's defense in the Florida versus Georgia water rights dispute, where her strategy and advocacy led to the United States Supreme Court unanimously ruling for Georgia and dismissing Florida's claim. Okay. The next step on her career path was the bench. She was appointed first to the Georgia Supreme Court and then to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, where she continues to decide cases with courage, clarity, and an enduring commitment to the rule of law. If I might add a personal word, I am profoundly grateful that I have been able to call Judge Grant my boss, not once, but twice. She first took a chance on me when she was Solicitor General of Georgia, and I was a very young lawyer, just a couple years out of law school. And then she later hired me again to be her law clerk when she was appointed to the 11th Circuit. Those experiences were, without a doubt, the greatest honors of my professional life. And during those years, I saw firsthand her insistence on the highest levels of excellence in every aspect of her work. Her rigorous textualism in statutory interpretation, her faithful originalism in constitutional interpretation, her respect for the role of states in our federalist system, and her deep commitment to the rule of law. In addition to all of that, those were the most joyful years of my career. My husband, Thomas, has often remarked that I was never happier than the years that I was working for Judge Grant. And he is right. She truly did infuse joy into every day, finding moments of good humor and just fun while taking her work profoundly seriously. That is a rare combination, and we are so delighted to have this extraordinary judge as our keynote speaker. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Judge Grant.
Wow. I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to Tori's very kind introduction of me. I was going to thank her already for her introduction, and even more so for her thoughtful leadership of this chapter, for her excellent service as one of my very first law clerks, and for her friendship over the last decade. Having law clerks is one of the biggest privileges of my job as a federal judge, and I'm incredibly thankful to have started out with Tori to set the standard high for all who have followed. I'd also like to thank the Atlanta chapter of the Federalist Society. This organization was an important part of my welcome back to the Georgia legal community after spending my early professional career in Washington, D.C. and California. The chapter continues to provide great programming and great fellowship for the legal nerds of Atlanta. And of course, I would like to thank the Federalist Society as an organization, which has been instrumental in encouraging lawyers to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy in law school and beyond. In particular, I'd like to thank Dean Reuter, the Executive Vice President of the Society, who is here with his lovely wife, my friend Luann, and Jim Kelly, the Director of the Society's international efforts. Both have been great friends and supporters of mine, and I appreciate your being here this evening to support the Georgia chapter, and me too. I thank my fellow judges, both state and federal, professors, officials, dignitaries, and friends. I appreciate your all being here. I'll confess that I did not realize when I agreed to give these remarks that I would be missing my son starting for the first time in his high school's varsity football game. So now you know why my speech will be 5 minutes long. No, I'm kidding. His dad and I are hoping for some great NIL deals, but he is a long snapper, so the first step is letting people know that that is a position in football. For those of you who do know, I'm sure you'll agree that it's the perfect spot for a great kid who can handle pressure and is not all about the glory. We live in challenging times. I think that's been, frankly, a theme today. There's anger everywhere. The murder of Charlie Kirk, the murder of the Minnesota Speaker of the House and her husband in their home, the attempted assassination of Justice Brett Kavanaugh at his home. The list tragically could go on. People disagree about fundamental questions and don't know how to get around it, and sometimes wonder if it even is worth getting around it. It is. Our Constitution is worth defending, and it is worth using it to get around the problems that we face. In fact, it was designed with the understanding that Americans would disagree about crucial issues for reasons both good and bad. When I was sworn in as a federal judge, I took 2 oaths. One was the constitutional oath, in which I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This year in particular, 2 events come to mind when I think about protecting and defending our Constitution. First, we're facing the 25th anniversary of 9/11. And second, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. These events seem very different, and they are very different, but they both speak to our responsibility to protect and defend our great Constitution. I'll start with my own 9/11 story, which Tori helpfully referenced. I'd been working at the White House for only about 2 weeks, and my husband and I didn't live too far away, so I often walked to work. 18th Street to Connecticut Avenue to 17th Street, then across Lafayette Park, onto West Executive Avenue, and into the White House. I'll never forget how beautiful it was that day. 72 and sunny, not a cloud in the sky. I can still feel the warm sun on my cheeks and the wonder of walking up to the White House to start my day at work. I was sitting at my desk on the 2nd floor of the West Wing, and my boss was out for a meeting. I answered the phone shortly before 9 a.m., and it was a friend of his. He kept telling me that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center, but I didn't believe him. We went back and forth, and finally he said that he wouldn't joke about something like that. Because there was no internet news to speak of then. Some of you remember that. At the White House, we all had TVs near our desk, and so I went and turned mine on. And of course, I soon realized that he was right. It was shocking, but at that point, it still could have been an accident. I immediately got up and started telling everyone in the West Wing to turn on their TVs. I'll never forget standing in the hall, walking down the hall, and hearing everyone scream at the same time. And of course, we all know that that was when the second plane hit the second tower. I overheard someone from the National Security Office say that now they knew it was a terror attack. But believe it or not, it still had not occurred to me that the White House could be a target, or even Washington, the innocents of September 10th. Everyone stayed at our desks. Except the vice president, who I later learned had been carried out. I'm glad that he was safe, but I've often thought that maybe the Secret Service could have just mentioned it to the rest of us, that we might want to step out. But that's all right, everyone ended up fine. So after the Pentagon was hit, though, it became more real to all of us. The threat was not only to New York, it was to Washington, D.C., and the United States, and our government, which means our Constitution. Even so, we were still not evacuated, at least from the West Wing. Eventually, we were brought down to the White House mess. I'll never understand going to the very bottom of a building. It's not a great place to be if you're worried about a fourth plane. But that's another sign of just how completely the surprise is astounding. No one was prepared for that. But there we were. We watched a giant TV where we saw smoke from the Pentagon rising up behind the old executive office building. We saw the towers burning. We were holding hands and praying. And then it was over as Secret Service agents ran in and told us to leave. We all started to walk out. We were being very good, orderly, like good Republican officials would be. But no, they wanted us to run. They began to yell at us. We now know that they thought Flight 93 was headed for the White House. Ladies, take off your heels. Go, go, go. And we did. We felt physical fear, of course, but also something bigger, a complete lack of comprehension, and an overwhelming sense of threat to our government and even our freedom and our way of life. After a lot of uncertainty about where to go and what to do, no one was there to tell us. Some of my colleagues and I started walking back to my house. Many of them lived in Virginia across bridges, and as I said, mine wasn't too far away. I still remember that on our walk up 17th Street, people were still having breakfast in cafes outside or working construction jobs or painting houses. No one seemed to know yet. We huddled in my home with my husband stuck in his job in suburban Maryland. We tried to reach relatives, and we watched the towers fall. I didn't believe it at first. And for many years, when I would see the footage again on 9/11, part of my brain would hope that I had somehow imagined the whole thing because the towers couldn't possibly have fallen. But of course they did. And some of you remember this, and those of you who don't still need to hear about it. We went back to the White House to work the very next day. It was surreal. It was quiet on the way there, so quiet. They handed out printed White House cards listing the evacuation location in case of another attack. They quickly collected and shredded those cards after realizing how deeply foolish it was to put it in writing. Another short-term decision was to restart White House tours on September 12th. As I'm sure you all remember, if we changed anything at all, the terrorists would win. But again, the decision makers quickly realized the folly of having visitors in the White House. So that was soon cut off too. My office had shifted from domestic policy to domestic consequences. For weeks, my walk to work was difficult, with armored vehicles surrounding the White House complex and ID checks far beyond the actual gates. But everywhere, there were American flags. In windows, above doors, on walls. And I'll never forget one in particular. A very fancy jewelry store on Connecticut Avenue had no jewelry on display. Just a tiny flag and an empty case, and a sign that read, "And our flag was still there." And it was, and it is. Shortly before we got that flag, we got the Declaration of Independence, which defines the spirit and backbone ideals of our country. We all know this part. I think you said it earlier. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. How extraordinary to get agreement on these ideas, that humankind is equal and dignified, with our rights coming from God, not man. That our government is only just and legitimate when it's based on the consent of those governed. These points infuse the Constitution. And the part of the Declaration that gets less focus, although not today necessarily, is the list of grievances against King George. There are 27. I won't keep you from the bar by reading them all, but trust me when I tell you, as you heard again earlier, that many, even most, challenge the king's defiance of laws, refusal to pass laws, and refusal to assent to laws. A commitment to the rule of law has defined America since the Declaration. As Thomas Paine put it, in America, the law is king. And for as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. After the Declaration, we won the Revolution. We tried a loose system of government, the Articles of Confederation. That, in short, did not work. But the Constitution did, and it still can. I want us to remember three things. First, the problems that we are dealing with today are serious, but they're not new. Second, the Constitution is designed to deal with these problems. And third, we are in this together. First, the tensions we face right now are not new. Yes, the particulars look a little different, but fundamentally, people have always had very different ideas about how to solve our problems, and sometimes about what those problems even are. Think of the time of the Declaration and then the Constitution. 13 colonies spread up and down a continent with different interests, different people, and different ideas. Some of the colonies were agricultural, some were more commercial. Some insisted on the evil of slavery, others rejected it. Some had mostly English settlers, others had a greater variety. In fact, about a third of Pennsylvania was German-speaking. So the Pennsylvania Assembly ordered a German translation of the Constitution to be distributed during the ratification process. Popish was a top insult in the early United States because of animosity and suspicion of Catholics. There was a literal riot by the Anti-Federalists in New York after Virginia ratified the Constitution. People had different ideas and priorities, just like we do now. It seems appropriate at a Federalist Society gathering to quote the Federalist Papers. Madison himself explained in Federalist 13 the ease with which people can disagree about matters great and small. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. Sounds familiar, right? As Madison also explained in Federalist 1, laying out the groundwork for the Constitution, even good and wise people can disagree strongly on political issues. We, upon many occasions, see wise and good men on the wrong as well as the right side of questions of the first magnitude to society. This circumstance, if duly attended to, would always furnish a lesson of moderation to those who are engaged in any controversy, however well persuaded of being in the right. Now, as my husband would testify, I'm usually not uncertain about whether I'm right. But the funny thing is, neither is the other person on any side of a given question that any of us is involved in. And that doesn't mean that one or the other of us is bad or evil or hates America. A few years back, I was at my law school talking with students after an embarrassing incident that you've probably all heard about. Students on the left shut down a Federalist Society speech by a federal judge. Horrifying and disappointing lack of commitment on the part of those students to free speech and viewpoint diversity, not to mention respect for the federal judiciary. The students were discouraged by the incident, but they appreciated the law school's quick stand in favor of the First Amendment. But here's the point. They seemed surprised when I told them that tensions had been high when I was in law school too. They seemed to think it was all new. And when they asked what issues had been controversial when I was there, I listed several just off the top of my head. The Iraq War, same-sex marriage, budget deficits, Social Security reform. And they were incredulous. They could not believe it. These issues, all of which are important, have either been settled one way or the other in the public mind or diminished in public prominence for whatever reason. If only anyone still cared about the deficit. But from 2004 to 2007, views were strong on all of these issues and wide-ranging and polarizing. But we could still have discussions about them among friends, and then we would go grab lunch or a beer depending on the time of day. As James Madison put it in Federalist 10, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, differences will be formed. And that's okay. We cannot expect to all think the same thing, but we can expect to engage with each other. And the founders knew this. That brings me to the second point. Our Constitution designed the structures of government to work in the real world, a world where factions compete and citizens have dramatically different expectations and experiences. So our system does not assume that everyone gets along and sees things the same way. Exactly the opposite. Human nature is top tier in the Constitution's structure and design. As Hamilton explained in Federalist 51, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That's a tall order, and one under constant challenge, including, but certainly not limited to today. Faction was one of the founders' chief worries. Faction, of course, is a group of citizens, whether small or large, that have a set of needs or interests that are adverse to those of other citizens. And faction, Madison tells us, is inevitable in a free system. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. But with that in mind, and with the Declaration of Independence's exhortation that government can only be just when it has the consent of the people, our framers designed a system of checks and balances, the regular distribution of power into distinct departments, the introduction of legislative balances and checks, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior, the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. They are means, and powerful means, by which the excellencies of Republican government may be retained and its imperfections lessened and avoided. The separation of powers seems obvious to us, but it was not at all obvious at the time of the founding, and at the Constitutional Convention, each of the branches of government was crafted and recrafted and fought and refought by men who had different ideas about how to fulfill the promise of the Declaration. The legislature was the most important and powerful branch. Candidly, that too seems somewhat quaint today. But our government is not a parliament with Congress consigned to support every initiative of the president. And many of the Supreme Court's precedents in recent years have, I think, pushed both Congress and the presidency to do their jobs. The Major Questions Doctrine, for instance, demands that Congress really say so when it's giving broad and significant authority to the executive. And the demise of Chevron means that the executive has far less license to stretch the authority granted by Congress in statutes to its absolute limit and sometimes beyond. The separation of powers and the conflicting ambitions between branches was set up in part to make it hard to do things without consensus. One faction cannot implement all of its preferred policies on day one. It needs to negotiate and bargain and find common ground with other factions and groups of people to make things happen. That can be frustrating, but it's the way our system was designed. And there was, I think, one overriding feature of the legislature, which was to make it hard to get things done. The government was built to make broad consensus necessary, not optional. This leads me to my third point. We cannot forget that we are in this together. A recent poll reports that almost 2/3 of Americans think our country is too politically divided to solve the nation's problems. But I can't believe that's so. Think of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of our greatest and most influential founding fathers. They met in 1775 and collaborated on the Declaration of Independence, growing even closer over the early years of the Republic. But as time went on, their differing political philosophies pushed them apart, even into animosity. In the 1796 presidential election, Adams won and Jefferson was his vice president. Can you imagine a Donald Trump, Kamala Harris administration or a Kamala Harris, J.D. Vance White House? It's no surprise that this did not bring them closer. And 4 years later, when Jefferson was elected president, Adams subjected him to midnight political appointments just before his inauguration. These two heroes of early America, central to the Declaration, and the two presidents that followed the great George Washington, were effectively enemies and did not speak or write for over a decade. Of course, the happy ending is that they eventually reconciled their friendship, even if not all of their ideas, and both died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration. Again, it may be easy for us to think that the rancor and bitterness in our country is new, but it's not. And we should hear Madison's exhortation in Federalist 14. Hearken not to the unnatural voice which tells you that the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, can no longer live together as members of the same family, can no longer continue the mutual guardians of their mutual happiness, can no longer be fellow citizens of one great, respectable, and flourishing empire. Let us all do our part not to fall into the trap that has existed from the start. Let us protect and defend the Constitution, which is made to deal with just these problems. Judges have a particular role, to decide cases without fear or favor to either party, saying what the law is and not what we think it should be. The role of a citizen is different, but there are some parallels. Expect each branch to do its job under the Constitution. And don't be satisfied with extra-legal or unconstitutional acts because you like the policy outcome. The rule of law and our Constitution demand more. And here's one thing that all of us can do. Stop judging ourselves by our best intentions and our opponents by their worst acts. Let's reverse our thinking. I'll close where I began. 3 days after 9/11, on September 14th, I went to the National Prayer Service at the National Cathedral. I was nervous. I think everyone was. The president and the cabinet would be there, plus senators and members of Congress and various other dignities. It felt like a risk. It was a risk. America was under attack, and the day was grim gray and drizzly. It was a very dark mood. But oh my, what a service. The U.S. Navy Band sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and I'll never hear that hymn again without returning to the National Cathedral in my mind. President Bush spoke powerful words that we can hear today. It is said that adversity introduces us to ourselves. This is true of a nation as well. In this trial, we have been reminded, and the world has seen, that our fellow Americans are generous and kind, resourceful and brave. We see our national character in rescuers working past exhaustion, in long lines of blood donors, and thousands of citizens who have asked to work and serve in any way possible. And we have seen our national character in eloquent acts of service. Inside the World Trade Center, one man who could have saved himself stayed until the end at the side of his quadriplegic friend. A beloved priest died giving the last rites to a firefighter. 2 office workers, finding a disabled stranger, carried her down 68 floors to safety. A group of men drove through the night from Dallas to Washington to bring skin grafts to burn victims. In these acts, and in many others, Americans showed a deep commitment to one another and an abiding love for our country. These people surely had different views and ideas, but on 9/11, we were all Americans, and that was it. The prayer service lifted our spirits. It brought us together in grief and service and love of country, ready to do our part to carry forward. The day had started gray and dark, and as we walked out of that cathedral, it felt like a miracle. It was beautiful. The redemption of sunshine and blue skies. I'll close with more words from President Bush at the prayer service. America is a nation full of good fortune with so much to be grateful for, but we are not spared from suffering. In every generation, the world has produced enemies of human freedom. They have attacked America because we are freedom's home and defender, and the commitment of our fathers is now the calling of our time. Our country, this is me, not President Bush. Our country, even when things look dark, is not done. Our flag was still there. Our flag is still here. And our Constitution is still here too for us to protect and defend. Thank you.